Hello, everyone. Welcome to the In Demand podcast. My name is Asia Arangio. I am joined by my lovely co-host, Kim Tlarzik, and we both work at DemandMaven. DemandMaven is all about helping SaaS companies and PLG companies troubleshoot growth when they're stuck, when growth is slow, and they cannot figure out what to do next, or even what the root cause is. So we come in, we help companies identify root cause analysis, help them figure out what's actually going on, and then prioritize projects, define projects, and structure projects for the team or the founder or co-founders to take and execute from there. And we've worked with over 100 SaaS companies doing exactly this. And it's been a blast. We get into all kinds of stuff like activation, acquisition, pricing, churn, mitigation, competitive intelligence, all kinds of fun stuff. So that's what DemandMaven does. Today on the In Demand podcast, we are talking about two things. I actually want to catch up with Kim on hobbies and chatting about hobbies because touching grass is important. And we're actually going to talk about pricing today. So if you want to skip ahead and get to the pricing part, I totally get it. But if you want to stick around and just chat with us a quick minute on habits, because we've had this discussion before and I wanted to follow up with Kim on it actually.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, so for context, Kim and I have been talking about hobbies and like what do you do? Like what do you do to disconnect, touch grass for fun? I have ADHD, which means I have a bajillion hobbies. So I think the ones that are the most prevalent for me are going to be I'm a big tennis player. I'm cooling off a little bit on that now, but just because the time is going to change and it's going to get really dark early, and I do like playing tennis at night, but I find that tracking the ball is actually a lot harder. So I do a little bit less of it. I actually don't mind the cold. I love playing in the cold, actually. It's one of my favorite times to play. But tennis is a big one. I write a lot of poetry. I make art. I entertain myself with YouTube, but I don't know if I consider that a hobby. I'm a little bit chronically online. So I play sports to get me literally out of the house, off of the computer or my phone. And then it just depends on where the wind blows of where I'm going to get into next. But right now, big ones are, and garden. Garden is another really big one. We just got the fall garden in. And Kim and I were talking about hobbies and how like you're like, I need some.
Right. How I don't have any. I'm so jealous of all your hobbies. Yeah. So, and it's, I have two kids, so that makes it a little bit harder. But I feel like been sometimes chronically stuck in like, what should I do for fun? I don't have ADHD.
That we know of.
But yeah, so then you brought up the motivator. Is it the motivator code?
The motivation code, yes. So what I recommended to Kim, or what I said, my hobbies make sense since I've taken the motivation code, which I think it's just the motivationcode.com, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. It might be motivationcode.com. Let me double check. Motivationcode.com. Yep. So I took the motivation code. It's just motivationcode.com, but I call it the MC, I guess. But I did this a year or two ago, and it suddenly explained what motivates me in work, but also what motivates me in my hobbies. And so I was kind of like, oh, you should take this, and then let's see what your motivations are. And now we can kind of reverse engineer maybe like what hobbies like would be interesting, like that would fit that you'd be motivated to do. Because part of like what makes a hobby, in my opinion, is it's something that it brings you joy, it helps you disconnect, but it's also like naturally in tune with how you like to show up in the world anyway. It's something that you don't have to force, or at least not like maybe in the way that sounds like. I do think you have to put in energy to be consistent, but it should feel natural. Like it shouldn't feel like you've got to like throw yourself into it all the time. I kind of go with the flow because that's just how my brain works. But anyway, so mine like makes total sense for what I do. And I feel like yours, like we can figure out what are some things that come to mind. Okay, so I took the motivation code. Let me pull up my top 5 really quickly. But my top 5 motivators, and this is like so me to a T. It kind of hurts actually. Okay, here we go. Okay, so my top 5 are, my number 1 motivator is to demonstrate learning, meaning I learn how to do something new and then I show that I can do it. That is my number 1. Now, this is a 1,000,000% true in my hobbies and also at work. So for example, in DemandMaven, when I learn something new about how to do pricing, which we're going to talk about today, I immediately want to try it. Like I'm like, okay, well, I've learned all these things. I want to go do it now. And to demonstrate the learning, like that's like a huge piece of what gets me into all the things that I get into. It's also part of why DemandMaven has as many offerings as it does. It's part of why DemandMaven has as many offerings as it does, but that is like a huge part of what gets me into just like all the things that we do now. It's not just, I guess, like high level strategy. Like we look at acquisition strategy, we look at activation strategy, we look at retention and how to mitigate churn. We look at like all different kinds of things. And it's 100% driven by me learning more and more and me kind of connecting the dots between all those things. So that's my number one. And my number two, I won't go through all five, but I think part of what makes me go deep is my number four, actually. So I like to advance. I like to make progress as I accomplish a series of goals. And also my fifth is excel. I want to give my absolute best as I exceed performance and expectation. So that's part of why when I do get into something, I'm like, I don't have to be the best. I want to make sure I'm constantly making progress though towards being the best. And when I think about my hobbies, it's like almost one, it's like this, it's the same, except for my hobbies, I don't, I talk about this with my sports psychologist a lot, which I do have a sports psychologist because I was struggling in tennis with my serve. I have a great serve, but I was struggling mentally with trusting my serve and trusting myself to deliver a good serve, if that makes any sense. Anyway, but when we talk about like playing tennis, for example, I don't need to always win. I just need to always give my best. And when I'm not giving my best, I get so frustrated. And so for me, it's not about being the best. It's about making progress towards being the best version that I can give. And it's a slightly different mindset than like winner takes all versus playing the infinite game of like becoming, so to speak. When I think about gardening, so gardening is, I mean, demonstrate learning, because like gardening is science. It's also fun and intuition as well, but it's also a lot of science. It's art and it's science. It is a lot of science. And so I love the like, let's demonstrate learning. My number two and my number three are realize the vision and make an impact. So for me, gardening is like, I want to demonstrate the learning, but I also have this vision of it just would be so cool to just go to the garden and just pull some food and be like, this is what I'm eating today. And that I was so in love. It's a very romantic vision, but I was in love with this vision and all of my motivation, like all of my motivators kind of collapsed or condensed into not like the perfect hobby. Like there are seasons where I don't always garden. I went 2 years not gardening before we moved into the house that we're in now. But all that to say, like it did kind of condense into this is why I do this. It's part of these. Now that brings me to yours, which I think are so interesting because they're like the opposite of mine, which is why I think this test is so fascinating. So if you're like, ooh, the motivation code, definitely take it. Motivationcode.com. I think it is very cool. Yeah. It explains a lot of, at least for me, why I do what I do. I feel like yours, I was like, this is Kim. Your number one is collaboration. You like to collaborate with others. You like all of yours are very like people. Like you need to be around people. You like to identify and fulfill needs. So you like to see and find gaps. Your number three was taking charge. So being in charge of, this was very like autonomous. Like it sounds like you're motivated by the autonomy of something, but also being in charge and taking that responsibility. Yep. I do not have this. So I kind of wish you lived in Georgia so you could be our tennis team captain, because I feel like you do great. Like you would do so good.
Right.
I'm captain again and I'm like, I don't want to do it.
That does make sense. I've heard you complain about that.
I have complained about this before. There are just some scenarios where I don't want to take charge. I don't want it. No thanks. But when it comes to hobbies, at least, I don't always want to be like the point person. When it comes to work, like, you know, for me, it's like I got to pick and choose. But no, the fact that this is number three for you is like, ooh, okay. And then number four, improve, consistently seeking to make things better and enhance them. I identify a lot with this. I can see this a lot in you. And then number five, I cracked up so bad. Be a key person who holds things together. Kim, if that is not you, I don't know. I'm like, Kim is literally what holds DemandMaven together.
Right. That is funny. It is true.
So hobbies, I had so many ideas. Hobbies could be, I mean, like, yeah, like being surrounded by people or like being involved with people where you can collaborate. I think that is important. But then also, we're gonna say more like leadership type experiences where you can, you know, be the key person or be in charge. And then like the meeting needs and improving, that was making me think all of these. I was getting ideas of like, I feel like you do great volunteer work like that. I don't know if you're interested in volunteer work, but
yeah, I do a little bit of it actually, which aligns. And it's funny, I never think about it as a hobby. My husband and I actually started our own little community giving group, which tracks, and I actually kind of run it. Of course. So like, there we go. It's funny because sometimes the admin gets a little heavy, so it doesn't feel like a hobby, but I really enjoy, we meet quarterly with the group. And there's all sorts of people in age ranges. And I leave that feeling very fulfilled. But that's once a quarter is when we meet. So it's like, I probably need something that's more often than that.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, so I think finding, and what's funny is, you know how like, do people have like reading as a hobby?
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
what's funny is that's so accessible and I actually enjoy reading.
Hmm.
But, and I think, well, maybe I should like reading should be my hobby and I can get like more, but it's not with people.
Yeah.
So it really makes sense why that it can be a hobby of mine. It could be something I do to like unwind,
Mm-hmm.
which is how I use it.
Mm-hmm.
But based on this motivator code, can it be like a true hobby that fulfills me in certain ways? Probably not. And that's probably why. Because I'm not being key, I'm not connecting unless I'm in a book club.
I was gonna say book
maybe.
club. Yeah.
Yeah.
Book club.
So in those, I find some book clubs to be annoying, and I like, you
Some are a
know,
little
maybe I need to
cringe.
start my own.
Start your own. Be the key. Yeah. Take charge.
Right.
Those are
Right.
that was 3 and 5. Yeah. Be key and taking charge. Totally.
Right.
So maybe it's like, yeah, like it could be book club. You can also stack. So this is what I've learned too is I think a lot of people think of hobbies as like you have the one thing that you do all the time. I think about it like maybe there are 3 to 5 things that you do that you kind of oscillate between and it stacks within the month. So like gardening and tennis and my poetry writing and the story, like I do storytelling too sometimes where I'll like go to like a storytelling open mic. I never talk about that. I don't know why I don't. It generally slips my mind. Then there's like when I'm making art, it's all very much depending on the season and the time of the month and all those things. So you might find that like some seasons are heavy book club seasons, some are heavy volunteer seasons. But if you have enough of those things, then you never feel like you're like, okay, well, what do I do with my time?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah, I love this though. I'm so curious what you end up getting into. But I my mind was like food bank, community gardening. Like I think a community garden would be cool. Because then again, like it's anything you can bring like people together. And then I was thinking there was a random one that I thought of, but I was like, I don't know if I could see you doing it, but I did think of it. I'll have to think of what it was. It was something kind of random though. I was like, Kim probably wouldn't do this. So there's Rand and Geraldine, Rand Fishkin and Geraldine DeRoeder of Moz and Sparktoro. I don't know if they think of this as a hobby, but they do like kind of like cooking nights. Like they invite friends over, they cook. And they entertain, I guess is the better word. They do like regular entertaining.
Yeah.
I've always been like, is envious the right word? Envious is the right, yeah, better than jealous. I've always been a little envious because I'm like, I want to do this so, like, I would love to do this. Zach would love it, my husband. And the motivation 3 is not like the take charge. Not me when it comes to that kind of stuff. So I'd really be depending on Zach to do it or to like to organize, I should say. But when it comes to like curating an event or like curating like a self-expression related to food, that's what I like about how they think about it. Like it's part of their self-expression. And like what dishes do you pick? And I don't know, I just like what cocktails do you serve? It's part of their like both of their expressions because Geraldine is a food writer and Rand is a foodie and it makes sense. So anyway, they're like I'll have to think of the random one that I thought of though. I'll have to remember it. But I just remember being like, Kim would never do that. But it'd be kind of funny if she did.
All right. Well, if you think about it.
I'll have to think about it. So speaking of getting into all kinds of things, that brings us to pricing.
Yeah.
The Busy Founder's Guide to Pricing. So we're finally here. And I could speak forever, I think, about pricing. And I think a lot of it is because it does kind of feel like one of those sciences that is like mystic almost, I think, for a lot of founders. There's lots of content about pricing. It doesn't get the same love that customer acquisition does or marketing does because so much of what founders struggle with in the early days is just getting customers. Pricing and monetization really becomes something I think that people think about later. Like it's almost, I don't want to say like an afterthought, but it is kind of like an afterthought. But you do get to a certain spot in the business where you need to pull the pricing lever. So this is my verbal guide to pulling the pricing lever. Like how do you do that in a way that is standardized, operationalized, and you don't completely outsource it to where you don't learn anything about it. You do need to learn how to do this internally. We are going to certainly talk about your options related to consultants versus DIY and what the trade-offs are. But I just kind of want to give people like, here's the stages or phases of pricing. Here's how we think about doing pricing, putting in finger quotes, like how do we execute against monetization? And then again, like what are your options? So I'll start with the first, which is the phases of pricing. So most founders start And most early stage companies start in a very like consistent way. And that's looking at competitors. When I think about most people's early pricing, 9 times out of 10, it's we did a research. And when I say research, we looked at other competitors. What are they charging? Based on what we do, what do we think our value metrics are? So a value metric is, it's usually a product related metric where the more that someone consumes of something, the more that you charge in theory. So value metrics could be things like like how many seats or like user seats are you giving away? It could be very highly specific to your product. So for example, if you have like a calendar or like a scheduling app, maybe it's the number of calendars. And the more calendars that you need, the more that someone pays. You can also think about other aspects of your product that this could be. Again, like it really depends on your product. But generally speaking, like your value metric is the thing that if someone consumes more of, you would then therefore charge more for it. Any pricing scenario can have several value metrics, but there usually is like a primary one where this is really where the bread and butter is. And this is the most consistent thing that changes across our plans, our packages, or whatever it is that we're doing. The next thing to think about too is our plans and packages. So do we offer more than one way to buy? Meaning maybe there are, I mentioned plans or packages, but you can split up the product in a number of ways. You can also just offer one that maybe scales in a particular way according to your value metric. There are a number of ways to think about this, but that's typically what people start with and how they think about it. Usually it's looking at competitors and then they kind of make some assumptions and make some guesses based on just what they're seeing out in the market. And this works. Like when it comes to getting started and you're less than $1 million, yep, makes sense. I have no qualms with that part of the process.
Yeah. So it sounds like you don't need to overthink it too much necessarily. Put something that makes sense out there based on the industry with competitors.
Yep. The key to pricing and the key to charging is you really don't know if you have product market fit until you charge. So that's part of why I say whatever it takes for you to get it up there and just to go and like to do it and to see like, what kind of business do I have? Great. So if it's comparing it to competitors, makes sense. Start there.
And of course, basic profitability metrics.
Right. Like we do want to make sure we're creating something sustainable. So I wouldn't say, blindly copy competitors, or even like, let's say you're kind of making it up as you go. Maybe there aren't any direct competitors and you're kind of like, I think pricing should be this. I would say something is better than nothing. However, we do still need to make sure we're not creating pricing that is not sustainable. Like it costs you more to deliver than it does what you're making it. Like making off of the revenue of that. So that's usually phase 1, and phase 1 makes sense. Like I said, I have no qualms with phase 1. You have to get through phase 1 to get to phase 2. Phase 2 is what I would consider to be, we are now optimizing pricing, or we are at least testing pricing to understand what levers can we pull when it comes to pricing in our market and monetization in general. So this, I would say, is again, like you're pulling different levers in pricing specifically to really understand what are your ceilings and what are your floors. Most products have a floor and a ceiling for what they can charge with the way that it is structured and designed. The moment that you change the design of pricing, then your floor and your ceiling may also change. So for example, you may have a product that's one size fits all, and there aren't any other tiers. You can't maybe even change like, how many seats are you paying for? Like it's just you pay the one price and that's it. The second that you adjust that and make it, let's say it scales based on how many seats you can add, and maybe you introduce a second plan that is like more like it's like the luxury version of what you've got, and you have like the basic version, or like the basic versus premium. Essentially, you have now changed those models, that context, and now your floor and your ceiling of what people may be willing to pay has also changed. So this phase 2 is really all about understanding what levers can you pull within pricing to achieve the absolute best possible balance between the revenue that you're getting and the value that people are expecting to receive from the product. And that should feel seamless pretty much every time. What I mean by that is customers should never feel like it is I should rephrase. Customers should always feel like it is a no-brainer to pick the plan or the pricing or whatever it is, to pay for what they're paying for. It should always feel like a no-brainer. It should never feel like they have to emotionally, mentally, and like physically overcome barriers every time they want to give you money in exchange for the software.
Right. And that's qualified customers, of course.
Qualified customers, correct. That's a great clarification. This is not, everybody and their grandma. This is for the absolute best paying customer. It should feel like a no-brainer. And the reason why is because of behavioral science. But behavioral science says that if we want a particular action to be taken, we have to make sure that the barriers to that, both psychologically, emotionally, mentally, and also physically, all of those barriers have to be minimized enough for that to feel like a no-brainer. Like, yep, like this is an easy resolution for me. There are scenarios where you do want friction in pricing, but I do think that those are very specific scenarios. The vast majority of people listening to this episode are going to be in the this needs to feel seamless bucket, if that makes any sense. So we're in phase 2. I'll come back to phase 2 in a second. I just want to briefly talk about phase 3. Most of what we're going to talk about is actually phase 2. But phase 3 is like, I consider this to be, you are flying, like your pricing, like you have really dialed it in. It has supported NRR very positively. Excuse me. What that means is pricing really supports NRR and that it effortlessly creates expansion revenue, which is the ideal for most SaaS companies. If we don't have expansion revenue, we're missing out on a huge part of what makes a SaaS company go, that beautiful curve that everybody wants. Expansion revenue is a huge part of what makes it happen. But we have the expansion revenue, and also you can tell that pricing is pretty optimized when you have plans that do have pretty great retention, net revenue retention, and also you have a pretty good distribution of customer across the different plans. What I find is usually if you there are some people who might disagree with this, which is totally okay. I'm actually open to learning more about this, but what I find is there seems to be a pattern where if you have like 80% of people are on one plan, but you offer 3 plans, it's either because you're not attracting the right people for the other plans or they're not the right plans. So what we find is not that everything needs to be perfectly even, but I will say it is a good signal when you have your 3 plans. They have great retention across the board long term. So again, people who buy those plans more than 12 months, they retain. And also you do see good expansion between the plans. And it is relatively evenly distributed between all of them.
Mm-hmm.
The exception here would be enterprise plans, but that is more just because of volume than anything. It's like, just...
Right. It might be a lower volume, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the revenue might be high.
Right. And then when you say expansion, are you talking about add-ons within a plan or people jumping from like a low plan to a mid, or both?
Both. Yeah. Both. What we would like to see is a healthy balance of no matter what plan people start on, there's a really nice natural progression into either the next plan over some period of time or adding add-ons over time. And yeah, like that's typically what we're looking at. So, but phase 3 is really all about, okay, you're flying, you've got it really dialed in. What's going to make phase 3 interesting for you is when the market shifts. So AI, for example, is coming in and changing everything. These things you can't necessarily predict, but what you can say is, okay, when the market shifts, you may have to adjust pricing accordingly. And then also similarly, as your product continues to evolve and grow, you are going to continue to evolve and grow your pricing. But if you already have a pretty dialed in foundation, this is very easy in my opinion. Like I would say it's easier. I don't want to say it's easy. It's still hard work. It's easier because if you have a solid pricing foundation, in theory, new additions to product, new additions to the market. So as you expand and grow, the way that you think about pricing hopefully doesn't feel in conflict with where the business is going. Although certainly it is the case where as you grow and scale and expand into new areas or expand the product or what have you, as new competitors pop up, as the market changes, pricing is always going to also change. But hopefully you don't have to completely overhaul everything. Although I will say that might happen. You might have to completely overhaul pricing. Intercom is actually a really good example of this. Intercom is a SaaS darling, unicorn, I think technically. I think in the last year or two, one of the founders, if I'm not mistaken, came back to the company and was like, hey guys, I hear the complaints about pricing. We're going to overhaul it. And I think that they went back, if I'm not mistaken, they might have gone back to like an OG version of their pricing back when people were like, this makes more sense. But basically, Intercom had kind of gone down the path of, we are going to continue to tweak and push pricing until it became less palatable for customers. And my guess is that they probably were seeing not great, like long-term churn is what my guess is. So much so that I want to say that like one of the OG founders actually came back to the company to like come back and like fix it basically. I don't remember all the details. I should probably have looked this up before, But I was thinking of like publicly, like this is a great example. And then also another good example is, oh gosh, not Zenefits. It's a Z support product that I'm not going to remember.
Zendesk?
Zendesk, thank you. Zendesk is another good example of this. They have consistently changed pricing over the years. I think that they're actually in a pretty good spot now. But I do think that because of market shifts, I want to say that they're having to go back and think about their pricing. And I think we're kind of seeing that like live, like in real time, or at least in the last like 1 to 2 years. But there was a good sweet spot that they had where pricing was very much aligned with where the market was and, you know, everything else. But what we're going to discuss is you are going to have to, it's not a you might have to, you will have to adjust pricing as you go no matter what you do, because people are changing, your product is changing, and so is the market. And like, new market entrants happen every single day. Competitors enter into the market every day. It is folly to not optimize or work with pricing over time. But phase 3 is a pretty nice phase to be in, unless, of course, you have to completely overhaul everything, which does kind of suck. But you almost have to go back to phase 2 or even phase 1, where you're like, you know, you have to make a dramatic change and you kind of get back to that. Like, this is streamlined and it is in alignment and going with where the market is going. So as the market shifts, you're shifting right with it. But phase 2 is really where I think the most of the magic happens, so to speak. Like, that's where a lot of the effort gets put into. Phase 1, you're just putting pricing up to survive, basically. You're really focused on product market fit and getting new customers and all the things that create the foundation for sustainability. By the time that you get to phase 2, that's where you're starting to think long-term sustainability and not just short-term, like survival. But phase 2 is usually when we get tapped to do pricing work. And I think that's part of what we're going to unpack here in a second.
Yeah, that sounds good. So typically people are coming to us. Now, when people come to us, do they say pricing is an issue, or do they maybe not know pricing is an issue?
Usually it is the latter. It's a great question. Most folks don't think pricing is actually what's holding them back. And I think that's why pricing is an under-pulled lever. So if you know me from the microconf and tiny seed space, you have heard Rob Walling, for example, say, you should just double your prices and just see what happens. Like, you probably will be making a lot more. And he is 100% right. You absolutely should. Once we start getting into phase 2, though, doubling pricing is a pricing experiment. There are about 5 to 10 others that you could be executing that could also have a very positive impact on the business. Doubling the pricing and not seeing the churn move much is great. I have, however, seen companies take that advice too literally for too long. So I've worked with actually like 2 to 3 SaaS companies in the last 2 years where they did exactly that. And Rob's advice is not bad advice. It is good advice. The issue is, I think some people think that they need to just do that forever. And that's the only pricing experiment that they ever run, is just doubling it. But what we have discovered is, while there might not be upfront short-term churn, there is long-term churn, so NRR. So going back to Kim's question of, do people always think it's pricing that's the issue? Most, I would say, don't. But when we work with a company and we're troubleshooting growth and like, why is growth so slow, and identifying root cause, often what we find the issue is because pricing was changed, but nothing else really moved with it. And also pricing was changed in a way that was not data driven at the end of the day. It was more on vibes, and, you know, what works for someone else is not necessarily going to work for you. And so I think there's a little bit of like misapplication of certain contexts. I think doubling your price makes sense if you're only charging like $25 a month. When you're charging $300 a month, doubling your price may or may not pan out the way that you want it to. And you might not see upfront, immediate, sad, scary churn. What we find is it's more like people will wait until 6 to 8 months later, and then they're kind of like, why am I paying so much for this? They double the price and I don't get why, or whatever. And then they churn. So you might not see it upfront. And I think that's the danger to doubling your price without being data driven. Again, that's one experiment that you can execute. I want to talk through some of the others that you can execute. So when it comes to phase 2, again, because, you know, most folks don't think that pricing is actually what's holding them back, but it usually is one of the things. It just might not be the top priority. But when we're troubleshooting growth, pricing is one of the very first things that we look at. There are a couple of signs. So the first, I mentioned before, the first sign that you might need to enter phase 2 quickly is assuming all other variables are true, you are working towards product market fit, do have pretty, like, you're working towards solid net revenue retention at 12 months, you have a consistent stream of customers. Assuming those things are true and you've kind of put those fires out, so to speak, the next big fire is probably going to be pricing and monetization. So I look for, is there a relatively good distribution between the plans? Are we seeing heavy churn from one plan versus another? Are we seeing good net revenue retention from these plans at 12 months specifically? And if you've been listening to this podcast, you know what NRR is. So I won't wax poetic too much here, but we do have other episodes that talk about this specifically. And I'm also looking for, when we conduct qualitative interviews, when we capture qualitative insights, are customers kind of side-eyeing the pricing, like in the interview itself? We've had that happen before. We worked with a company a couple of years ago. They were struggling with extremely slow growth. We're talking like 2% annual growth year over year. They had tested pricing like 5 or 6 times in that 2 years, and everything was flat. Like nothing seemed to be like really working. We work with them, identify root cause. We identified that activation was an issue, but then also pricing was an issue. And we figured out that it was pricing because of 2 things. The first was, when we looked at their NRR chart, we would see some weeks or some months would be very strong NRR, and then some would be like all red. And we were like, what happened in these months or right before these months that led to this? And then they were like, oh, well, we changed pricing like a few times. And I was like, okay, that's probably what it was. When we did the interviews, we heard from customers, yeah, and the pricing is weird. And we were hearing it based on the type of customer. So some customers would be like, yeah, like the pricing is fine for where I'm at, but like I would never upgrade for these reasons. And we'd be like, that's interesting. And then we'd hear something similar, but maybe different value metrics. So some people would say, I don't want to pay per seat. I'm just giving you examples. This isn't like actually what the client experienced, but I'm giving you examples to kind of translate. Some would say like, it doesn't make sense for me to pay per seat or pay per appointment or pay per whatever because of my business, because of these reasons. We talk to other customers in maybe different segments, and they'd say something like, I want to just pay by appointment. I don't want to pay for bundles of appointments. And the bundles of appointments is what's getting me stuck. But I would increase how much I'm paying. But if my business isn't growing, it doesn't make sense for me to pay you more, basically is what it was, which it was really interesting. So sometimes pricing can kind of come up in interviews, and that's what made us say, like we should probably dig into this. It's probably worth unpacking. And we found a lot of things that I mentioned before. So most, like 80% of customers were on one plan. They weren't expanding into the larger ones. And then we kind of thought like the smallest plan we figured would be the most popular, but it actually wasn't. It was the least popular. And it was because of some of the restrictions on that plan based on where people who would be on it, who wouldn't want to pay more and then therefore churn later. The other thing too was net revenue retention was not great. Like it was at 6 months, it wasn't great, which means at 12 months, it was worse. So that really led to us saying, okay, we got to unpack this and really dig into pricing. I'll pause there. What comes up for you when I say that? When I describe that?
So now I want to hear the rest of that story.
Okay, yeah. So that particular company, when we unpacked pricing, and I'm going to kind of talk through, like if you're in phase 2, this is the process. So we got the insight or the clue that pricing could be an issue because of the interviews that we were doing for another reason. When we actually did the pricing work, this is traditionally the process. This process, I'm going to compare it to other processes that you can do. Again, we're going to get into options a little bit here. But this process is really it's that busy founder's scrappy guide to pricing. And you don't have $100,000 to spend like on a pricing consultant, for example. So the scrappy guide is, there's willingness to pay, which is a type of understanding what people will pay for a particular product. There's pricing research, like interviews that you can conduct. And then there are all kinds of other like methodologies that we're going to talk about. But the core that we use are willingness to pay surveys. Then there's pricing interviews. And then the third part is pricing design that is based on analysis from the product itself. Those 3 things combined will help you form a few hypotheses. Now, what's interesting about pricing is there are many ways to do it. There are a lot of wrong answers when it comes to pricing, but there are actually a few right answers. And what I mean by that is, with pricing work, what I have discovered is it's not usually like, here's the one pricing that works perfectly. It's usually like, we have 2 to 3 ideas actually for pricing of what we could do. One stands out as maybe the better bet. The other is maybe a little slightly more risky, or maybe there are different trade-offs. But usually with pricing work, there are dozens of things that are like, that's wrong and we should not do. But there might be like 2 to 3 things that you should think about trying. And they may be different structures, but they still could potentially be the thing that helps. There are many different types of pricing, like structures. Like there's, good, better, best plans and packages. There's like an all-in-one where you pay one price and it scales based on some value metric. There are all kinds of ways to kind of like slice and dice pricing. But for the most part, you are going to come away with like 2 to 3 of those that you're like, okay, I think there may be a little bit of overlap, but we should try these, and the others, not good ideas. When it comes to the process, I mentioned, the very first are surveys. So when we do pricing work, the first is we have to gather qualitative feedback. And I know you're like, Asia, you're going to tell me to conduct interviews. Yes, we're going to conduct interviews and we're going to do surveys. We're actually going to do both. So the first is a survey. Although I will say, I think for the sake of process, I actually would do interviews first. I mentioned the second step is interviews, but actually it's technically the first step. The first thing we're going to do is we're actually just going to talk to customers about the pricing as it is. And what we do is ideally we select 10 of your absolute best paying customers. They don't have to all be your best paying. We could also maybe pick 5 who are very active, but maybe aren't as vocal. Maybe you don't have an NPS score for them. But ideally, we want to talk to your customers, both like best paying and then maybe some who are active, but maybe possibly neutral. And these interviews are incentivized. And the whole goal, honestly, is to go through and get feedback on the pricing as it is. So what works about it, what doesn't work about it. And then also, we do like to ask some Van Westendorp questions. Van Westendorp is a very specific type of pricing questionnaire survey. Most researchers just use it in surveys, but we actually like to ask it in person. And it basically just asks questions like, what's the most that you would pay for this and it feel like a bargain? What's the most that you would pay for this and it feel like a stretch? What's the least that you would pay for this and it still feels like a good deal? And what's the least that you would pay for this, but it feels like really cheap and you wouldn't buy it? So those are the 4 Westendorp questions. You would add those also to a survey. But we like to do this in person first because getting people to commit to a number is actually really interesting, like psychologically. Most humans in general are going to kind of, there's intent versus action. And like a lot of people will verbally describe what they would intend to do, but in real life, they might not actually do exactly that. It's very common. But what's interesting is you still get the psychology behind why they pick numbers. And that's the whole reason why we do it. Even if the number itself isn't something that you can necessarily like 100%, put all your money on and like bet on it. Sometimes the number doesn't matter as much as the why behind the number. In fact, I would say that's almost always the case, especially like an in-person interview. But we typically conduct pricing interviews. We actually will also conduct, sometimes we'll actually conduct UX pricing interviews where we have either customers or prospects, like audience members, strangers who've never seen your product before and have never used it. We actually will have them review the pricing page to see, does this make sense? And like, does it feel like this would be valuable? And or you wouldn't ask it exactly like that because obviously that'd be very biased. But your goal is to understand what are their first impressions of this and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. What's confusing as heck?
What do they miss?
What do they miss? What questions do they have? What anxieties come up for them as they review the pricing page? So UX interviews are a critical part of this. And then like the main 10 interviews. So the UX you don't need that many of. You just need like 5. But like the main pricing interviews, you need about like 10. You want a mix of people and really talking through, again, like what works about the pricing and what doesn't. Are there any frustrations or stresses? Are there ever any moments where you're like, this doesn't make sense to me or what have you? And then similarly, you can also ask expansion questions like, is there a reason why you haven't expanded or moved up to the next tier? And understanding all the ins and outs of that. So gathering that insight already, like if you were to just do that alone, you would get 10 things to go and execute that absolutely would help impact growth, like 100%. I can actually guarantee that because I've given that advice and that feedback for free. And I've gotten people calling me back being like, I did what you told me in that call that we had. They didn't even pay me for a project. I just told them, do this. And they did. And then they came back and they were like, we've actually increased like revenue by 30% just by doing this one thing. And I hate to promise silver bullets, but it's not a silver bullet, but it's a small thing out of the million things you can do. But just doing those interviews, you'd be shocked at what comes back and what small things you can do to make a big impact later.
For the Van Westendorp questions, are you giving a range or are they pulling a number out of their hat to start?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I mentioned interviews being one step. The other step would be a survey because 10 interviews is a lot, but you really want, like if you have hundreds of customers, you want to run the survey if you can. The Van Westendorp, there are 2 ways you can think about this. You could have it as just like a blank open box, like an open text. That will give you less normalized data. So if you don't mind normalizing that data, because it's an open text box, if you don't mind normalizing it later, then it's fine. You probably could put a requirement of it that it's like number only or something, so you only get numbers. But sometimes people will write paragraphs in those like little text boxes, and they'll be like, well, I would do 50, but 100 this is too much. Like, I just wouldn't do that. And like, you get like a lot of like extra like back talk. Like, not that it's bad. It's just, you get a lot of mental like justification or validation in that box, and that may or may not be helpful for you. It just depends on, I think, in your context. I think the way that we like to do it now is we like to just have it be I think we do the open text, if I'm not mistaken. But I do think it depends on the client.
Yeah, we've done it, but I feel like we've done ranges as well.
We've done both.
And yeah.
Ranges, I think, are really helpful when you're going to get hundreds of survey responses, and you want to ensure that the data is normalized. So what you do, for example, is, now the issue with this is the range. You don't want to cap yourself at the same time. So like, if you offer a range of numbers, so meaning like there's like a drop down selector, or maybe there's like a slider bar, and people can slide like, 0 to like $10,000 or whatever. Depending on your product, you might only offer 0 to 100. Or if you're enterprise, you might be like, minimum 5K to 60K. It really depends, I think, on like what numbers are you dealing with here and who are your customers. You also might have some that are enterprise and some that are small, and you got to adjust the survey based on that. I think that is part of why we do open text, is because if a client has a lot of different types of buyers and they're paying different amounts based on their size or some other factor, then we do the open text, because then you can at least filter based on the type of buyer. But that's a good question. So I do think it depends. But if you want normalized structured data, you would offer the range, like a slider or like a drop down of some kind, and offer like numbers that people can just select. Otherwise, an open text would also work. But keeping in mind, you're going to get a lot of like people who are going, like, they're like in a chokehold about the number that they put down. They want to explain it or what have you. And some people don't put numbers at all. You got to deal with that too. Some are like, I hate this question, I'm not answering it. And it's like, okay.
All right.
But Van Westendorp survey, so that's another step. We do the interviews typically first, because that helps us structure the survey that comes later. So with a willingness to pay survey, usually we're doing Van Westendorp of some kind, but we'll also include other questions that help us qualify the response, meaning like, how can we gain information about the person to help us understand who this is, or like what type of buyer they are, and possibly their jobs to be done. Also, possibly we get into features and then modes, but the survey is also critical because we also include what we call max diff types of questions. So instead of doing Likert scales or prioritization questions where it's like rank each feature 1 through 5 based on, I guess it's technically still Likert, it's just combined, but like rank each feature like 1 through 5 of what's most valuable to you. So we find like those are not nearly as helpful as what we call max diff, where maybe you have like a feature set in a grid, and we say what's the most valuable feature here and what's the least valuable feature here. And then we analyze the data based on what people say, but they can only select one thing that's the most valuable and one thing that's the least valuable, and they have to answer that question. Max diff questions, we use it for several things. We use it for feature questions, helping them prioritize features. We also use it to help understand add-ons and like what would be most valuable as an add-on. We use it to understand preference for how people would like to pay. So for example, if you're stuck on value metrics, so let's say like you could charge for a number of different things. What you could do is you could do a max diff question, and you could ask, what would be the most ideal way for you to pay for the product? Or you could word it like, which of these is the most valuable to you from the product? And you could have each of your value metrics written in a way that makes sense to people. We typically just do like number of users, or this is highly dependent on your product, fill in the blanks. But if we're like a scheduling app, it would be like number of users, or number of calendars, or number of integrations, or number of blah, 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 some volume, percentage of transaction. So like maybe you take payments through your app or through your scheduling app, and it could be like percentage of the app fee or whatever. But you can actually ask people, what would you prefer to pay for? How would you prefer to pay? And select most valuable or least valuable. And they have to only pick one for each column. So they're not going to be able to select like 5 things are most valuable, because that's the opposite of most valuable. With most valuable, it's got to be the one thing. What's the most valuable out of this list? And then you conduct your analysis from there. So we use that across the board in the survey. Usually the survey is anywhere from like 15. It's usually about like 15 questions. Pricing surveys. So one thing that we do talk about are optics. You don't necessarily want to blast to the whole world that you're about to change pricing. Usually you want to email a subset of customers. Hopefully you get at least 25 to 50 responses. Although I find sometimes when it comes to pricing, people have opinions. So out of everything that you do research wise, pricing will get you the most feedback, hands down, because people are very sensitive generally about what they're paying and how much they're paying. So if you want to manage optics here, if you have a very large customer base, you don't want to spook anybody, you might just want to send it to a portion of your audience and not like everybody. But if you have a small customer base, then this might not matter as much. But what makes sense to me is just making sure that people understand that you are going to be sensible about this, and that it's not just, each individual that you're thinking of. You're also thinking about like the whole, like the group, each group that can be identified. So that's step 2 of phase 2 is the survey.
Okay.
It's a lot of analysis. Then we get into step 3, which is product analytics, which is one of my faves. There are a number of ways to do this. So like really fancy pricing consultants, they go hard on step 3. They go hard on step 3 because this is where the data is dating, so to say. So they are deeply analyzing, usually, if the good ones are at least, deeply analyzing overlap of what features are getting charged for in each plan versus how much usage is actually happening in each of those plans for each of those features. And you end up with some really interesting charts and graphs here. I've seen some cool shit, I'll be honest. Like, I've seen some pricing consultants create some like wild things. I'm like, whoa, how did you do this? But it's basically like, I think anyone technical could actually do this. It's interpreting it that's hard in my opinion. But basically it's several charts of what are people actually using and how does that overlap with other features? And that helps you identify what should probably be in certain plans based on cohorts that you're analyzing. So let's say, for example, you were to look at one specific type of segment, and it's a specific type of buyer, ideally with data that you're collecting about them, so like you can actually do this analysis. This is often an issue that I see for a lot of companies. They're not able actually to do this analysis because they're not collecting anything or enriching anything, but I digress. But they're basically looking at an overlap of, for this specific segment of our customer base, what's the overlap of all the features from what they're using? And how is that different than maybe other segments? And what you might find is that certain segments use specific types of features in a particular way. And that can actually influence how you think about structuring your plans. So the pricing interviews and the willingness to pay survey, those things influence now what we're going to go and dig deeper into based on the answers and the data that we get back from that. So it's hard to say exactly like what should you be analyzing in step 3, because it does depend on what you get in step 1 and step 2. But step 3, this is where we're opening up Amplitude, we're opening up Post-Hog, Mixpanel, whatever your platform is. And we're probably doing some really intense database queries of understanding product usage, and ideally like user type / plan type, like whatever segmentation we can do from here to unearth patterns based on actual user like usage data, based on real use data. And this is the key, is this shouldn't be like hunches and vibes and feelings. Like this should be actual data-based, like actual real insights-driven pricing work. Because what you run the risk of is, yes, like let's listen to what customers and audience members and prospects are saying and like what we're hearing and gleaning from that. But most people, when it comes to usage at least, they either overestimate or underestimate. It's rare that people are just like dead accurate on how they actually use things. Usage data is going to be a lot more reliable in this scenario. So the combination of all 3 of those things, because you're going to get a lot of information back from this. Now we have to synthesize that into pricing hypotheses of what do we think pricing, like what form or shape can pricing take based on the known knowns, the known unknowns, and then you won't know the unknown unknowns. Those don't surface. And are there unknown knowns? Are there unknown knowns? No. Well, maybe. I guess those are like assumptions that we're not aware of or we're conscious of. It's like things that they're not aware of, but which is
now
possible.
You're just confusing me, so I don't know.
That
one I got lost.
There are certainly known knowns, and then there are likely known unknowns. So things that we know that we don't know. Like we know we don't know what this is going to do. And there are the known knowns, which is we know what we know. And yeah, unknown unknowns you won't know at all. It's impossible to know those. But yeah, I guess there could technically be unknown knowns. Those are your assumptions, though, is what I'm thinking. From there, I mean, yeah, you'll craft those hypotheses. Like I said, usually you'll come away with like 2 to 3 different ways to think about pricing. And now what needs to happen is you go into the fourth step, which I didn't talk about, which is you're actually implementing some pricing experiments, we'll say. And you're now fully living phase 2 of the pricing journey, of the monetization journey, of you have conducted this analysis. And if you've never done this before, the first time you do it will feel very intense. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of data running around, and you're not sure what is signal versus noise. And that is very overwhelming, I will say, without a partner in this or without someone who's experienced. You can learn this. I'm not saying that it's not learnable. It absolutely is. I'm only speaking as someone who's done it several times across different companies. And I am also still learning. Like I'm coming across new pricing approaches and strategies all the time. And I'm like, ooh, I can't wait to try this. Learning being my number one motivator here. Demonstrating learning. But all that to say, I can imagine if it's your first time doing this, it is really freaking hard. And you're like, I get why founders don't. I totally get, because it's a lot of work. Important is that there is work and that there is a process. It doesn't have to be, you're covering your eyes and you're just like picking something, which I think is a lot of what happens today. I think a lot of it is, oh, let's just like do what so-and-so competitor's doing and then call it a day. Which
right. Making, like you said earlier, the company that was making multiple changes. But if you're not basing it on these 3 phases and looking at data, then now you're sort of willy-nilly changing things and you don't know what the effect is.
Right. Or even, when I think about pricing, and really a lot of the work that we do, especially when it comes to like root cause analysis, we are ultimately looking at, we're trying to use to some degree the scientific method of, we have observed, we are forming a hypothesis, we are gathering information and data to inform that hypothesis, and now we are going to design experiments, run them, and then learn from them. And then we're going to do it all over again. And I think that feels very daunting if you don't know what information or data to pay attention to. Again, signal to noise is really tough in general in growing businesses, especially SaaS businesses, but I think it's especially tough in pricing. And so I think the typical process is there's a lot of product analytics. So I think what most technical founders in particular are comfortable with is, let's analyze the product. But what they're missing is the qualitative. And that's why that doesn't work all the time. You might get lucky and spring gold, but when you just look at the product and you do your database queries, but you never do the interviews, what ends up happening is you don't actually know what to dig into or what to peel back or what to segment or what to look at from a cohort perspective versus like a baseline and everything perspective. And so that is where we get into your options for like, okay, well, what can you do? Like, what are your options when it comes to executing the pricing work? So, or even coming up with a strategy or the process or what have you. So if me talking through this process made your eyes gloss over and you're like, I'm not doing that. Not only am I not doing that, Asia, but I'm also never going to pull the pricing lever because it just sounds too hard. I get it. It is hard, at least the first time you do it. But then once you do it, you start to get it's a muscle that you build, and you build that muscle, you get more repetitions. And the thing is I've done pricing a bunch for a lot of different companies, but within your own company, you need to be able to do pricing at least once a year, because that's about the frequency that you'll need to look at it, truth be told. So every year there should be some type of pricing review. Is it still the right pricing based on how much we've grown, based on what we're hearing, yada, yada. And you can go through those first 3 steps that I mentioned in that phase 2, which is pricing interviews, pricing UX interviews also, let's not forget about those. And then running that willingness to pay survey. And then, yes, like let's do some, back-end product analytics work. But what I find is product data can't tell you why something is happening. And it also doesn't necessarily tell you where to dig further. And that's why you need the qualitative, because the quantitative is great. Don't get me wrong. We love the quantitative, but you really need both. So that way you can understand where should I be looking based on what we've heard and what we're seeing in the surveys and things like that. So your options are, and there are, you do have options here. The first is DIY, do it yourself. And I do recommend, if you're like me and you just like learning shit and trying it and creating your practice around being the CEO and the arbiter of growth for your business, do it. Like I highly recommend that, especially if it's low risk, especially if that excites you, if that gets you excited. If that does not get you excited, then DIY is out. Not to say that our founders that we work with don't get excited about it. It's just much more like their energy, their bandwidth, they are focused on a million other things. And while they would love to drop everything and go learn pricing, realistically speaking, they're not able to, or they're not, or whatever, which I get, I totally get. That's a lot of the reason why founders hire folks like us. So if DIY is exciting to you, I would also say too, if you're in the bootstrapped context, so you're not VC, if you're VC, I'm actually going to recommend that you hire a consultant / agency for this, or somebody. Like somebody should be a pricing expert either within your own organization, or you hire support here and then you learn it and then you deploy it, because you will probably waste a lot of time if you're VC funded trying to figure out how to do it yourself. So I will say that. But if you're bootstrapped and you're profitable and you're excited about DIY, do DIY. There are a number of people that I would recommend that you follow. Patrick Campbell used to be, I say used to be, he still kind of is like the king of pricing and also the king of churn when it comes to like how SaaS founders think about it. Patrick still has tons of content out there to this day about pricing, from Price Intelligently and also from Profitwell. So brush up on pricing through them and the resources they offer. They actually have a guide to pricing that I think is we've learned a lot from them. I certainly have. I learned about max diff from Patrick. So like highly recommend using that in your pricing knowledge or like intelligence gathering, so to speak. But there are others like Kristen Berman of Irrational Labs. So Kristen, I believe it's either, I'm pretty sure it's Kristen and not Kirsten. I'm pretty sure it's Kristen. Kristen Berman, love the work that they do at Irrational Labs, but they have a lot of like willingness to pay content. They also have like guides on how to like, they literally spell it out. Here's how we do pricing. Here's how you can do pricing. If that overwhelms you, obviously you call them. But all that to say, so those are some of the options to learn. There's also a book called Street Pricing by Marcos Rivera, I think. He spoke, I saw him speak recently at, I think it was one of the MicroConf New Orleans, possibly. And street pricing, I don't necessarily align with everything in it, but I would say 90% of it is it's like a great guide, again, to pricing. Now, assuming that pricing is an issue or a challenge that you have, and you know that pricing is a challenge or issue, tapping a pricing specialized consultant could very well make sense. So folks like Irrational Labs, I actually don't know if I don't know if Price Intelligently is still active. I feel like they are. Marcos also of Street Pricing, I believe he has his pricing consultancy. It might actually be Pace Pricing if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. I can't remember what his pricing consultancy is. But okay, so if that is available to you, so just so you're aware, there's a huge range of how much you will spend on a pricing specific consultant. So like folks who are like specialized in this, there is a range. There are some that are minimum 100 for a project. There are also some that are that plus a future revenue fee. I'm not going to name any names, but there are some, I've seen some pricing consultancies basically say, not only will you pay a base fee for this, but we will also charge future revenue for the next 2 years. So they'll basically take a percentage of your revenue for the next X whatever, but only for the percentage that grows. If you contract, then like obviously that doesn't happen. But so there are some that do that. Then there are some that do really small bite-sized pricing projects. Like we're talking like the 1 to 20K range. I say 1K, that might just be like a pricing audit and maybe they just look at your pricing page. And then there are some that are like, they will, walk you through a pricing project with the intent to kind of show you the process and show you the ropes, help you design the new pricing. But then from there, you can hire them again, or you can go and like start developing like your own pricing practice internally with like some advising or coaching from them over time. We fall in the latter. So we're more in that latter bucket where our pricing projects, like it's a one-time project. It's like a 4 to 6 week process. And the intent is to show you how to do this. That way you can do this in the future. And then maybe you just tap us for advising over time. And also possibly even to like remind you to look at this every year, because it's at least every year depending on how fast you're growing. So those are the options. I think some are going to be obviously more palatable to others. So I think for the earlier stage folks, the smaller folks, paying $100K or $200K for a pricing project is just not going to be realistic. Like that won't make sense. And while pricing is a great lever, and it certainly could 10x you, like I've seen companies just focus on pricing and they literally 10x. But the risk factor here is that pricing would have to be the only lever for you to pull for that to make that true. And like it would have to be pretty intense growth for that to be worth it. For my larger companies, so for companies that are more than 5 million, 10 million ARR, 100K to 200K on pricing is going to be nothing. That's going to be like a drop in a hat to me. The real tricky part to me is if the pricing consultancy is charging future revenue, like a percentage of future revenue, for example, that is the only scenario where I'm like, I just don't know if that is worth it in the end. I know some consultancies do. There are some companies though that like, there are some enterprise SaaS companies where that would not be an issue. Or if it is, it's like a very small percentage of the revenue. Like it's not like that much. It pays the pricing consultancy, but to the company hiring them, it's really not that big of a deal. There is also a difference between like your mileage may vary on the data fidelity here. So those fancy pricing consultancies where you pay 100K minimum, the data fidelity is extremely high. Don't get me wrong. Like usually they are doing very, very deep, intense analysis on the product side, the qualitative side. Like they're doing everything that I mentioned and probably a little bit more. Usually the data fidelity, like the fidelity of the insights that you get from them is extremely high. Like we're talking like 90% plus. Like if you do exactly what they're saying, you will probably grow X percent. Like they can actually even predict like how much you're going to grow based on what their models say. Sometimes I say sometimes, a lot of like the fancy ones, they actually might have like their own platform or system that runs these models, and they can actually project like how much you're going to grow, like literally based on the different scenarios that they predict. It's pretty cool. It's pricey.
I would imagine like enterprise level solutions, right? Companies that are selling that are looking into something like that if the price point is much higher.
Yeah, exactly. When the price point is that high, and I would say I wouldn't even say necessarily always enterprise, because again, if you're 5 million in ARR, 100K is not going to be, you'll probably get sticker shock at first, but when you think about it, that 100K will probably unlock the next 5 million. Rand and I used to talk about this all the time. Like he used to say, I'll spend the 200K if it means I'm going to unlock 2 million or a million, because that ratio of investment to growth is like almost nothing. Like, I'll 10X that. I'll invest in that to 10X.
I mean, we've worked with companies where we've helped troubleshoot, and you have said pricing could be a lever. You can go hire a fancier pricing consultant to do this work. And that might be something to untap.
There was a company that we worked with that was a year ago, and they were at 3 million. And I was like, the ROI here is a little tight, but like if you spend 200K on this pricing consulting firm, you probably will make your next 3 to 6 million in like a short amount of time. So I've absolutely recommended that before. And I think also too, they had like 10,000, actually maybe a little less, like 8,000. But I remember thinking the fidelity needed to be high, and paying that much would be worth it in that scenario. Now let's talk about when you wouldn't pay that much. So you wouldn't pay that much if you don't need the fidelity to be high. For example, if you know that pricing has not changed for 10 years, or you know that you've only really been kind of like tinkering with it for the last like 2 to 3 years, but you've mostly like ignored it. Like that is where you probably don't need high fidelity. You probably just need to do anything in a structured way with a provider that can help you like walk through it. That is where paying the 100 to 200K might not make sense at first. And you might not have the financials for that, but you might have like a 15 to 20K project. And that's kind of where like we would fall. And there are some that are maybe in the more like the 50 to 80K range. Not from us, but there are some pricing firms I do know that do charge like in that range as well. I would say, again, like if you know that you need to make any progress on it and you just need to you need to get comfortable with pulling that lever, working with a partner like us could be a great way to do that. But there are also others. So there are like pricing consultants who are, it's like a one-man show type thing or a one-woman show. And they're coming in and helping with that very specific thing. And it's a very tight project, tight deadline. And you probably won't spend 100K, but you'll spend some number. And that in theory will work as long as you are learning from that process. I don't think it's, and I say this, I was going to say it might not be sustainable to keep hiring people for this. I only say that though, because I do think that you need an in-house pricing expert of some kind that could be your CRO, but I think the CRO needs to still be informed to some degree by product data. And I think like that's kind of where your mileage may vary on your CRO, but someone in-house needs to learn this. and to some degree until you need maybe like really fancy analysis. And that's maybe where a pricing consultant still makes sense.
Yeah.
The larger you get, though, the more that pricing consulting firms become less of like sticker shock and more like this is, almost it's like an extension of your team, basically.
Yeah.
But not to toot our own horns, but if pricing is something that you know that you need to make progress on, but you're stuck and you just need to get in the rhythm of executing the process so you can continue to do that year over year. Some companies quarter over quarter, believe it or not, but for most, at least once a year, like let's look at pricing and just make sure it all makes sense. We're a great partner in that scenario for sure, especially if you don't need 99% fidelity. If you need like 70% fidelity, we really thrive, I think, also in that scenario too, where companies that we work with, typically bootstrapped, if you're VC funded, chances are you don't have enough data for data fidelity. So even like a provider like us would still be like really valuable in that scenario. But just getting in the practice and the habit of doing it and then walking you through the process of how it's done. So that way you can then go and do this again. And maybe you tap for, just like a little bit of like high level advisory in that way. But the goal is to get you learning how to do it so it's not so scary. And also so you don't waste your time testing 20 different things for 2 years and not growing or whatever it is. We just recently did this for a client and they have actually tripled their annual growth rate, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So anyway, so not to toot our own horns. However, if you are struggling with this is something that we do help with. And specifically with founders who, I get it if you're like, I don't want to learn this. If you're like, you don't want to do DIY, you want it to be assisted, then yeah, like we're like the perfect partner for that. And then as you grow and you scale and you get to the 5 million, 10 million range, the fancier pricing consulting firms are going to be also, I actually think that that's where like spending that much on pricing, it's going to be a no brainer because what you're going to unlock is going to like eclipse whatever it was that you spent. That's why I do think at some point those firms are very worth it. And some of them do offer like small offerings. Like I know Pace Pricing, if I'm not mistaken, they do a pricing like review like for a very small amount. I do think they might offer smaller projects, but we've been really impressed with their work in the past. But anyway, all that to say. So that is my busy guide to pricing. To give you context for how fast this can go, 4 to 6 weeks is all you need. You can actually do pricing interviews and do the pricing survey in as little as 2 weeks. The hard part, honestly, is exactly what you're imagining, which is designing your pricing hypotheses, coming up with those ways of structuring the data. Analyzing it, in my opinion, is actually pretty straightforward. It's really more about how you translate that into like actionable pricing steps to take. And then all the development work that goes into changing and adjusting the pricing. What I typically recommend is only rolling out new pricing for new customers. That way you don't have to worry about sending messaging to your existing customer base until you know it actually works. And I think that this is part of the process too, which is when you execute, like when you launch like new pricing, just do it for the new customers and track their progress for the next 6 months. If you notice that those new pricing plans have infinitely better NRR, you'll know within 2 to 3 months if it's tracking that way. But at the 6-month mark, if they have infinitely better NRR than your existing core base, then that's a really good sign that that pricing is probably better for the whole customer base. And then you can start thinking about how to roll out that new pricing to existing customers. But I recommend it this way because, Rob Walling says this all the time, but he's like, listen, run your pricing experiment on new customers only. So, it's on the website and it's the way that new users experience it, but maybe don't roll it out to existing customers because if it doesn't work, you'll know very quickly. And if it also doesn't work, you can roll it back in theory also pretty quickly. If you have really complex like engineering in the background with pricing, maybe it's time to also think about simplifying that. I'm not technical enough to tell you exactly what that would be, but I do know that there are some pricing environments where maybe like charge B is getting used and it's actually really tough to charge for a certain thing in a certain way. Or there's another one that comes up often that founders struggle with. I'm not going to remember the exact name, but sometimes it's like not straightforward how to like technically charge for something or to have it show up correctly in certain reports. But all that to say, if you know that you have pricing environments that are not conducive to what you need to do, this also could be a good excuse to like streamline that. But anyway, I digress. The goal is really to get it operationalized. And then also, again, once you set it, just focus on new customers. Don't try to roll it out to the whole customer base yet until you know that this is like way better than what you've got. And sometimes you learn that really quickly, but sometimes it takes like 6 months.
Yeah. I like it. Busy Founders Guide to pricing. And I think we found it can be very daunting. And even when you say, oh, you should do it every year, like in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so much.
It does sound like a lot.
But when you kind of learn it and you do it once, to your point, it does get easier, and it can become a practice then in the business and a growth lever.
And I think too, you might not have to do 4 to 6 weeks, pricing sprint every year fully, like completely. It might just be every year you're looking at your pricing plans and you're just taking note of a few different metrics of like, what's the distribution between all the different plans? What does churn look like? Net revenue retention look like at 12 months for each of these plans? And also you're just getting that critical eye of, do these value metrics and things that are in these plans make sense? And I think as long as you're doing that every year, you might make a couple of tweaks here and there, but maybe you don't overhaul everything every year. So I do want to clarify that, because I'm not saying that, but I am saying like we shouldn't be, okay, we did pricing and then now we're not going to think about it for 5 years. We shouldn't do that.
Right.
That to me that's crazy, because pricing quite literally is one of the easiest levers to pull.
You could talk to a few customers the following year after you've done a price, right? I mean, eyeing a little bit of qualitative, a little bit of quantitative data yearly over time. Yeah, that makes sense.
And also too, a lot of teams don't do surveys like regularly, but if you run like an annual survey, just generally, you could like slide in a pricing question just to kind of get general, like a pulse check of, hey, how do you feel about pricing? Does pricing still make sense?
Yep.
And maybe that is what triggers you to dig into it further. If you notice one year or one, quarter or whatever frequency you're doing, maybe like there's a quarter that's like bad or something. And you're like, oh, like a lot of people are like really unhappy with the pricing, or you're getting a lot of feedback that it's not working. So that's kind of where it's like, it is a little bit intuitive, but I do think we got to be intentional about it. And I think part of it is there's just no good way to operationalize around it without just committing to it. And I think part of the issue is mentally and energetically committing to thinking about pricing and monetization. We're in that now for in my fractional CMO role. We've been talking about pricing all year, and I think now we're finally like, okay, we got it. Like, we have to commit to this. But the commitment part is the hard part, because there's lots of things you got to commit to. But I agree. It can be small. It doesn't have to be big. You don't have to overhaul it every year, but you do need to think about it intentionally every year, at least, because the assumption is that you are growing and your market is changing and your product is changing. And that's why. And pricing needs to catch up, as it needs to really be the thing that carries you through, because we've just seen it, a million times now. Companies will set pricing and then not think about it for 5 years. And then they're like, why aren't we growing? It's like, well, This is the easiest lever to pull that we're not actively pulling. And that's, but anyway, cool. Did we cover it? Did we do everything?
I feel like we did it. I feel like you did it.
Yay. Okay. If there are any questions about pricing, I'm an open book. I will literally tell you anything that you need to know. But thanks again for listening and for joining us. And and if you take the motivation code, tell us what you got. What were your top 5?
Yes. Yeah. And Asia will tell you everything about pricing because of her motivation code.
So true. I want to demonstrate learning.
This is what she wants to do, people.
I mean, that and like 5 other things, but yes.
Yes, of course.
One of the 5. Cool. Thanks, Kim.
All right. Yeah. Have a good one.